In this video, we'll give a brief overview to Genesis 1 through 11 and then concentrate on Genesis 1. We'll want to visualize the general area where this material is presented as taking place, the ancient Near East. The Hebrew name for the book of Genesis is taken from its first word, Bereshit, Bereshit. This first word is in the beginning, a prepositional phrase. For those of us accustomed to the English Bible, you'll recognize that we derive our name from the Greek translation, the name given to it in the Septuagint, Genesis, meaning origin. The book of Genesis as a whole can be broadly divided into two groups. The first 11 chapters, which are often called the primeval era, or sometimes the prehistoric era, meaning prior to standard rules or styles of reporting history. And secondly, the patriarchal era. Here, this is dominated by major historic figures such as Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and so on. Chapters 1 to 11 and 12 to 50. Concentrating just on chapters 1 through 11, here are segments that issue from the plot that we find there. Cosmic creation, chapter 1 through 2:4, and then concentrating on the family of Adam, the generations of Adam, his household, chapters 2:5 through 5:1. Attention then focuses from chapter 5 through 10 on Noah and his more immediate descendants. When we reach chapter 11, there's the focus on humankind being dispersed, and this was pursuant to the Tower of Babel. In chapter 11, beginning with verse 10, we receive a bit of a ramp-up, a preparation for the story of Abram, which will begin more formally in chapter 12. So those last verses of chapter 11 provide background for what will follow in the beginning of the patriarchal section, Genesis 12 and following. We'll begin our focus then in the balance of this study on cosmic creation, predominantly Genesis 1. One of the things we want to do in this course, besides familiarizing ourselves with the content of this portion of the Old Testament, is to review and reinforce hermeneutical steps or exegetical steps. These you would have learned in varying ways through earlier courses in your study. Let's take a look at what those steps are. We routinely want to begin as we read a given passage with the step of observation, asking ourselves, just exactly what does this passage say? Here we seek to overcome inattentional blindness, perhaps due to familiarity with the story, and for many that would be the case with the passage we're reading today. We could almost quote the story in some sections, but we want to overcome that and listen afresh and see things that we have not seen before. One of the ways to achieve this is by focusing on various aspects, various angles of what's presented: the literary aspect, the historical aspect, and the theological aspect. After engaging in close reading of the text with observation tools, then we move on to the interpretation hermeneutical step. Here we ask, what does it mean? And ways to do this take the form of posing questions of the text. What's the significance of a certain observation that we made? Or what is the meaning of a certain observation that we made? Or inquiring, why did the author say it in this particular way and not in that way, using this word and not that word? Or spending more time on this portion of the account and being rather brief in some other portion. After engaging in interpretive questions, then we can move on to formulate for ourselves in our own words as concisely as possible what seems to be the central idea or the central message. This will not be comprehensive intentionally. It will focus on the main points and seek to be as concise as possible. Only at this point do we want to move on to the last step, which is application, asking of the passage, what does it mean to me? What difference should it make in my life, in the life of people who are seeking to follow God today? And this can be expressed both in terms of changes of value and also in terms of actual activities, tangible acts that a given passage would incite us, invite us, inspire us to engage in. So we have these 4 steps: observation, interpretation, formulating a central idea, and then moving on to application. Although these are intentionally sequential, it does not mean that you can't back up and re-engage an earlier step. That certainly is possible. You might be at the stage of asking an interpretive question and then discover something that you had not observed earlier. And so there can be a bit of spiraling deeper and deeper through these various steps. Let's then begin by making observations of the text. These typically can fall in the categories of literary observations, historical, or theological. First then, literary observations. Routinely, we want to be careful to be responsibly establishing the boundaries for a given section of Scripture. Have we chosen the right beginning point? Have we chosen the proper ending point? The case of Genesis 1 is a marvelous example of this. For our Bibles, routinely the English and the Hebrew Bibles make a break at the end of verse 31 in Genesis 1. So to respond to the question of wise or defensible boundaries, we would study that content and say, does this story, this episode, reasonably conclude with verse 31? Verse 31 reads, God saw everything he had made. Indeed, it was very good. And there was evening and there was morning, the 6th day. If this is a good defensible boundary, then the very next verse, that is chapter 2, verse 1, should be a different story entirely, or a very different episode, unlike the rest. Instead, we find that verse 31 continues actually in chapter 2, verse 1. That is the content of it. For we find that chapter 2, verse 1 reads, Thus the heavens and the earth were finished, all their multitude. Verse 2, and on the 7th day. So here is another episode, another component of the ongoing days of creation that were begun in chapter 1. Consequently, by asking ourselves validity of boundaries, this question, we find that we should not lock ourselves into the chapter breaks that we become accustomed to. In this case, we need to extend our study through chapter 2, verse 4, in order to get all 7 days. As to the early boundary, clearly we have no choice but to begin in Genesis 1:1, for there is no material prior to it. Continuing with literary observations, one of the basic questions of literary observation that we want to pose is this. As we read this passage, what terms or what concepts do we find recurring? What is repeated? And as we note them, we want to write down what verses they are repeated in, so that it'll make it easier for us to report that to others, or to compare our notes, compare what others are saying about that. I would encourage you at this time to pause the video, read over this material, Genesis 1:1 to 2:4, and make note of things that you see that are repeated, That way, when you restart the video, you'll find several of the observations you've made reinforced by some things that I'll be pointing out, and it will sharpen your skill and reinforce your sense of confidence that you're looking for and finding important features in the text. Please pause the video and make observations before continuing. All right, here is one sort of repetition that no doubt you turned up in your excavation of the text. And it has to do with there being a variety of verbs dealing with the activity of making something. So sometimes we find it said that God has created something. And the Hebrew for that happens to be the verb bara, which generally is reserved for the activity of God. Other times, the making happens with a verb that means make, distinct from the verb create. In Hebrew, that happens to be the verb asa. It's what we call a garden variety verb. It's very common. It can be used for God making something, for humans making something, and so on. At other times, we find making taking place as God issues an order. He doesn't make it directly, but rather he speaks it into being. He issues an order, and as a result, something is made, as in the case of light coming into being. Another avenue for things being made or affected in this passage happens when God commands the elements themselves to arrange themselves. So he says, let the water under the sky be gathered, issuing this sort of command that results in a rearrangement of the materials. And similarly, God commands elements themselves to do some making. Let the earth produce, let the land produce or bring forth, let the waters teem. So we have seen there lots of making happening in various levels with various styles. Another repetition that I'm sure you noticed was the metering of the progression of time, evening and morning, and day number something or other, moving through the various numbers 1 through 7. It's interesting when we get to the 7th day, the mention of evening and morning is omitted. So we have this cycling through periods of time. Here's yet another repetition that no doubt you observed. God issuing the evaluative statement that a particular item is good. And this leads to a climax in chapter 1, verse 31. Very good. And that follows God's review of all that he has made. Verse 31. God saw everything he had made, and indeed it was very good. And there was evening and there was morning, the 6th day. Incidentally, mention of God seeing everything that he had made, this can be labeled, as far as a literary device, as summation. Whenever you encounter the extreme words of all or everything in a positive sense, or none or nothing in a negative sense, these are universal in their scope. And they should draw our attention to realize that the writer is making a very strong point. Appropriately, that's signaling day 6. It's a climactic statement. Incidentally, it's no doubt on the basis of this sort of climax that early editors formed a dividing line at closing chapter 1 following this climax, and not including day 7 along with it. Again, that's a little misleading, but nevertheless, it's probably that climax which influenced the location of the close of chapter 1 in the editor's work. Here's another literary device, and here we want to be sensitive to a shift in genre. When we come to verse 27, we move into what people have recognized as poetic style, Hebrew poetic style, in contrast to the prose, the more simple stating of fact in adjacent surrounding verses. And here you see repeated elements. God created, he created, and also in his own image, in the image. This sort of repetition close together, and the inversion of order, the chiasm as it's known, created first and then image second, image first in line B, created second. This is also something that's often evident in Hebrew poetry. The third line of this repeats the notion of creation again with a little more color or definition, articulating particular the genders male and female. So poetry amid prose, our attention should be drawn to this. Here is another sort of repetition that may have caught your attention. And here it's not a literal word, but rather a concept that's recurring. It has to do with illumination or light making an appearance in the account. In day 1, illumination makes an appearance as God creates light. When we come to day 4, there is another mention of illumination, particular lights, plural, that God creates and establishes in the sky. The question then that we can pose, and we'll more formally move to a question formation phase a little bit later, but we can begin to introduce that process right now. The question this can pose is, when we come to the recurrence of illumination in day 4, is this intended as a bookend, so that day 1 is the start, day 4 is the end, and then we have a transition, as is suggested in the left-hand panel on the screen, transition to new material starting with day 5? Or is it that light in day 1 introduces a cycle of 3 days, and then the recurrence of illumination in day 4 alerts us to the reinitiation of that cycle, starting a new cycle? If that's the case, then we may be watching for parallel repetitions. And we'll want to look at day 2 and see if there's some parallel with day 5, day 3, perhaps parallel with day 6. That is in fact what seems to be the case. So consider this. In the first cycle, that is day 1, 2, and 3, we're introduced to creation of elements that are basically immobile, and they're more general in nature, like light being created in general, illumination, luminosity. But when we come to light in day 4, then it becomes specific lights. For example, the greater light, as the sun is referred to rule the day, the lesser light, the night, rules the night. Day 2, we're introduced to sky, an expanse, as it's sometimes termed, which serves as a divider, a separator between waters above, where eventually rain will drift down from that region, and waters below, the sea. When we reach the parallel day, that would be day 5 in the second cycle of 3 days, we find that God is creating and populating, creating living beings with which he populates the region that was established, the expanse that was opened up in the parallel day, day 2. What about day 3? Well, on day 3, plant life is developed on the region known as the land, and the land becomes the focus again in day 6, this time with animal life, those that will benefit from particularly the edible plant life. So you see some parallels, days 1, 2, and 3, as if they're establishing regions that later will be inhabited, and then days 4, 5, and 6 populate those regions which had been established or created, which leads us to the climax of the entire account, God finishing the work and then enjoying a cessation of labor. Sabbath means cessation, a stopping, which then constitutes rest. Let's touch on some other literary devices. Mention of heaven in connection with earth, heaven and earth, is known as a merismus, It refers to not heaven discrete from or with particular individuality from earth, but rather pulled together as a pair. Heaven and earth means the totality of creation. Another merismus could be day and night in some situation. In some story, if you say day and night, that means all the time, 24/7. Heaven and earth is operating in that fashion here. Closure is another device. As it happens, it is demonstrated, it consists of that same phrase, heaven and earth, because it bounds the section appearing in the first verse of chapter 1 and the first verse of chapter 2. We find thereafter in chapter 2, verse 2, there's a new focus, which is not directing the camera view so much on heaven and earth, but rather directing our focus on what the Creator himself is doing, namely celebrating the conclusion of labor and engaging in rest. Closure, when a repeated feature occupies the beginning and the ending of a given portion. Contrast, or the adversative conjunction, is one that we particularly want to be aware of in Genesis 1:2. We read, darkness was over the surface of the deep, and then the word but, the adversative conjunction, not and, as it's often and more simplistically translated, but the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. Umberto Cassuto, a very, very gifted Jewish commentator, points out that God's activity as his Spirit is already at the outset hovering over an almost a nurturing fashion over these waters, stands in contradiction or in contrast to the malevolence or the negativity of darkness and deep. Those were two elements that in the ancient world, the readers, when they heard of darkness in this context and of depths, watery depths, these were elements that would strike terror into the hearts of people. A human is at the mercy of others in darkness. A human is at the mercy of elements or malevolent creatures, sea creatures, in the deep. So the fact that God's Spirit is right there, present and already at work, is an enormous and a very reassuring contrast. Perhaps you've studied Hebrew. If you have, then you are aware of what's going on here. We are not reading in a different word. We're just acknowledging that the Hebrew conjunction and, the, as it's pronounced, can equally be adversative or non-adversative. Non-adversative would be and the Spirit. Adversative, but the Spirit. It's up to us as interpreters to sense when we should be reading it in English as adversative, and this is clearly one of those cases. Continuing with literary observations, the introduction of humankind at the close of creative activity produces for us a sense that God's involvement in making humankind occurs as a climax. It produces a degree of focus. Now, we want to acknowledge that this is not the last day of creation. The last day is day 7, and so we rightfully want to let that content stand as the entire episode's focus or a climax. Nevertheless, the fact that humankind is made, and there's really more space devoted to humankind, means that the writer wants us to have this information with particular importance. And here's a note that points out that the creative week doesn't end with humans, but with God. So humans are not ultimate. God remains in first place. God is the hero of the story. Jeremiah chapter 4 uses some language which becomes very, very poignant when we are aware and have kind of running in the back of our minds the creation account of Genesis 1. In this passage, which occurs in the middle of a larger oracle or prophecy or sermon by Jeremiah, the prophet has become aware of some disaster that's going to befall a nation. And as he sees this in his mind, as he sees this is going to take place, he begins to interact viscerally or emotionally with it. So he says in verse 19 of Jeremiah 4, my anguish, I writhe in pain. Oh, the walls of my heart is beating wildly. I cannot keep silent, for I hear the sound of trumpet, the alarm of war. And now moving down to verse 23, here is what he envisions. I looked on the earth, and lo, it was waste and void. The very words that Jeremiah uses there, tohu vavohu, are the same words that we find in Genesis, formless and void, here translated waste and void. These are not commonly occurring Hebrew words. When Jeremiah's audience heard them, they would instantly go in their minds to the creation account of Genesis 1. It was waste and void, continuing with Jeremiah. And I looked to the heavens, and they had no light. Boy, something is seriously wrong here. Verse 24 of Jeremiah 4. I looked on the mountains, and lo, they were quaking. The hills moved to and fro. I looked, and there was no one at all. All the birds of the air had fled. I looked, and lo, a fruitful land was a desert, all its cities laid in ruin before the Lord, before his fierce anger. What we want to take away from this parallel expression in Jeremiah 24 is the power of this vision, this declaration, because it serves to unravel and unroll all that was assembled and put together in the creative beauty of Genesis 1. The very features that made Genesis 1 so appealing and beautiful and declaring that God is doing good things and in complete control. Now in Jeremiah, we see that God's control is used to roll those back and bring desolation on a people that have unfortunately earned his judgment. So once again, the Jeremiah portion becomes much more powerful when we read it against the backdrop of similar language in Genesis 1. We can summarize a few of these literary observations that we've made as follows. Genre, for the most part, prose, although there was poetry in verse 21. Incidentally, Cassuto calls this incremented prose. That's his way of acknowledging that it moves through these various sequential days. We've seen structure, evidently with the first 3 days of creation being paralleled and enriched and populated by days 4, 5, and 6. Again, the poetry of verse 27, putting the focus on humankind in the flow up to that point, towards the end of day 6. Certainly there are other literary observations that could be made, but hopefully this gives you an idea of some of the primary ones. We'll move from this point to historical observations.